For the last year and a half, energy media has been arguing that the global energy transition is now being driven by China. And there's a great new report out from Ember Energy, which is a global energy think tank, that basically describes the nuts and bolts of the China's energy transition. So I'm going to be talking to Richard Black, who is the Ember's policy and strategy director. He's one of the authors of the report. Welcome to the interview, Richard.
Thanks, Malcolm. Nice to be with you.
I can't stress enough to my audience how important this report is because there is a fundamental misunderstanding of China in North America for sure. Because I talk to oil and gas guys all the time, and you bring up China, and all I do is go, oh, they're building new coal plants. We just dismiss them. And that's fatal because if you don't understand your competitor, your business model is doomed.
Yep, I completely agree with that. And speaking from Europe, I think there's a fundamental misconception in many places about China's journey here too. So the coal part of the story is a very interesting one because the reality is the Chinese government, like any government, is not going to risk the lights going out on their watch. And so while renewables are being built at an ever accelerating rate, there is still a coal fleet. But what we're looking at is coal-fired power stations that are going to be working for less and less of the time as their role switches to being a backup for cheaper wind and solar generation. And there are some recent policy changes that show this to be the case. The requirement on coal plants to become more flexible in their use, and also the decision a few years ago that some of the coal capacity is going increasingly to be rewarded for being there as a backup rather than for the wholesale electricity it generates. So that's a very good example, I think you've picked up there, Malcolm, of just how there is a misunderstanding that arises, I think, when you just take an oversimplistic look at just one piece of the picture.
There's another piece in this report that I was really excited to see because, again, we argue here at Energy Media that the real revolution in the energy system is not on the supply side. We've been making electricity for 125 years. We know how to do that. And if we didn't have wind and solar, we could still expand electricity supply. The real revolution is on the demand side. We can now make electric or devices that use electricity, and they are either competitive with combustion devices, or they are the lower cost, higher efficiency, better performing option. And we're seeing those kind of the demand side devices starting to push the combustion devices out of the market. And I think that has not received enough play, but your report does. I was impressed by that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, this is definitely one of the things that we wanted to look at because if we think about fossil fuel use and carbon emissions, for example, we see that replacement of in the demand side with electric vehicles and heat pumps and so on is going to be responsible for a greater cut in emissions than what happens in the electricity sector. So it is fundamentally important. And what I think is really interesting at the moment in China is that we're seeing the two trends which are sort of occurring almost simultaneously. There's the switch from coal generation to predominantly wind and solar generation, which is underway. And one very interesting stat that we found when we were researching this report is that earlier this year, the amount of electricity generated by wind and solar exceeded the amount of electricity generated by all other clean sources together, nuclear, hydro, biomass. So it's wind and solar that are driving this change. So that's displacing fossil fuel use in the power sector, predominantly coal. Meanwhile, out there in the big demand economy, as you said, transport, industry, and use in buildings, the fossil fuel use is being replaced by electricity. So electricity is already comfortably the biggest source of energy in buildings. It overtook coal as the biggest source in industry recently. And in transport is still dominated by oil products, but you can see the curve of EVs ticking up there. So you put those two things together, the replacement of fossil fuel burning by electricity, which is itself increasingly generated cleanly, and you have the beginning of the fossil fuel decline.
Here's this is another point that I think is poorly understood. And the global China driving a leapfrog strategy, just as there was a leapfrog strategy in telecom, where places like Africa didn't bother building landlines, they went right to cell phones.
Yeah.
And China is driving that kind of a strategy in the global south. And here's why it's really important for Canada. Canadians, listen up, is because the government, both in the Alberta, which is our Texas, and at the federal level, have bought in holus bolus to OPEC's oil and gas forever worldview.
Mm.
They believe, if you look at OPEC's modeling, it goes from 103 million barrels a day today to 20 million barrels a day of consumption, oil consumption by 2050. And it all comes down to the global south. OPEC says that the global north will gradually decline because of electrification, but electric technology is too expensive and governments won't subsidize it. And that's why oil and gas will predominate in Africa and Latin America and most of Asia and so on. And China is fundamentally disproving that hypothesis.
Yes, and of course, in many parts of the world, I mean, particularly Africa, where access to electricity isn't universal by any means, about half of sub-Saharan Africans don't have any access to electricity. There's no need to start with the fossil fuel system. And when you don't have a really national grid, and when you're looking for, first of all, for some electricity to charge your mobile phone and eventually to, generate bigger sums that you can build jobs on, you don't have to go down the fossil fuel route at all. There's abundant sunlight. Storage is now increasingly cheap, driven by the same manufacturing scale that we're seeing for solar panels, and most of that price reductions are coming from China. So you can leapfrog the fossil fuel era. And the same is increasingly true, I think, certainly for two-wheelers in the transport sector, and will become clear for four-wheelers as well. So absolutely, it's emerging, it's helping that leapfrog. And then you also have to think about geopolitics and diplomacy as well, because we've seen, over the last 10 years, increasing bifurcation between the sort of US and Europe-led world and China, Russia, India-led world. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but broadly speaking. And so basically, while the US is sort of withdrawing from those fields of play, China is able to cement relationships. And just earlier this year, for example, they had the China-Africa Forum, which is a forum that brings together pretty much all of African leaders together with the Chinese leadership. And one of the outcomes from that meeting was basically China increasing its support for solar power rollout and the development of clean technology, even building industrial supply chains across Africa. So that the sort of tilting geopolitics are playing in with the market economics to really add to China's influence across the global south.